My son looked me in the eye and told me it wasn't my house anymore. He said it in the kitchen, just after dinner, the kind with the island he and Sarah renovated last spring. We were in Naperville, Illinois, in the quiet neighborhood off Ogden Avenue. The dishwasher was running low and steady, a white noise against the words. It wasn't loud. He didn't yell. It was worse. He said it like a simple fact, like stating the sky was blue or that milk had gone sour. My hands were still warm from washing a single serving plate. A single plate, because I didn't eat much these days. If you've lived through something like this, let me know where you're watching from. I'm genuinely curious who else this resonates with. He stood by the new quartz countertop, leaning back slightly, arms crossed. Sarah was wiping down the stovetop, her back to me. Her movements were efficient, practiced. I saw her reflection in the dark glass of the microwave door above the stove. No reaction, not a flicker, as if this was a conversation they had rehearsed. As if my presence, my history, my very blood relation, was merely an inconvenience to be scheduled for removal. I stood by the sink, the warm water dripping from my fingertips. The air in the kitchen felt thick, suddenly hard to breathe. It wasn't just the heat from the oven, long since turned off. It was the weight of his words, settling onto my shoulders, pressing down. He didn't elaborate at first, just let the sentence hang there, heavy and final. It's not your house anymore, Mom. He wasn't asking. He wasn't discussing. He was informing. An eviction notice delivered not by certified mail, but by the casual indifference of a son to his mother. I looked around the kitchen. The gray walls they'd chosen. The new cabinets, dark wood, the little ceramic owl Sarah liked on the windowsill. It wasn't my kitchen. Not anymore. It hadn't been truly mine since I signed the papers. The papers that sold my house. The one I'd lived in for 30 years. The one where he grew up. The one where we'd celebrated birthdays and holidays, nursed scraped knees, and argued about curfew. I sold it to help them with the down payment on this house, their forever home, and to have a place to live, ostensibly with them, in the in-law suite they promised to build. The suite never materialized. Not really. It was just the guest room in the basement. Small, with one window looking out at knee-high level onto the concrete foundation and a patch of grass. A finished basement room. Yes, but a suite implied a bit more. Privacy. A kitchenette, maybe. Independence. They called it the in-law suite anyway. It sounded better. More generous. It made the arrangement sound like a gift they were giving me, rather than a transaction that had taken everything I had liquid and tied it up in their walls, their floors, their quartz countertop. I had moved in 6 months ago. 6 months of living in someone else's life, someone else's space. 6 months of trying to be helpful, quiet, unobtrusive. 6 months of feeling the slow creep of not belonging. The feeling had started small. Little things. A cupboard I wasn't supposed to use. A suggestion about meals gently but firmly overridden. My favorite mug put into storage because it didn't match their aesthetic. Each small act a tiny stone added to a weight I hadn't realized I was carrying. Now the weight was crushing. He wasn't telling me I didn't belong. He was telling me I had no rights, no claim, that my investment, my sacrifice, meant nothing. The dishwasher hummed. Sarah wiped. My son waited for my response. What response could there be? The truth, delivered so plainly, left no room for debate. It simply was. The house was theirs, and I was a guest. An unwanted, overstaying guest. My throat felt tight. I wanted to ask him what he meant. Exactly. Where was I supposed to go? What about the money? But the words wouldn't come out. They felt trapped behind the lump in my throat, a stone as heavy as the ones piled on my shoulders. I just nodded, a small, involuntary movement. Acknowledgement. That's all I could manage. He relaxed slightly, misinterpreting the nod, perhaps, as acceptance. He pushed off the counter. Good, he said. He didn't say why it was good, just good. Then he turned and walked out of the kitchen, leaving me with the humming dishwasher and Sarah's silent, efficient back. The kitchen, a moment ago just a room, had transformed. It was no longer neutral ground, it was hostile territory. Every surface, every appliance, every carefully chosen item felt like a physical manifestation of their ownership, their control. The ceramic owl seemed to stare, unblinking. I looked at my reflection in the microwave door. My face was pale, my eyes wide. I barely recognized myself. The woman I saw looked lost, fragile, not the capable, independent woman who had raised this man. The drip from my fingers was slow now, a steady rhythm against the silence. My heart was pounding, a frantic drum against my ribs. I wanted to run, to scream, to shatter something, but I stood frozen, anchored to the spot by the sheer force of his words. The house wasn't mine. Not anymore. It was a simple sentence, a devastating truth. The guest room, the in-law suite, was small and smelled faintly of the previous occupants, a lingering floral air freshener smell Sarah used. It was in the finished basement, painted a neutral beige, one window looking out at ground level, showing only the concrete foundation, and a sliver of the backyard fence. My belongings were packed neatly into the dresser and a small closet. Not m- Most of my furniture, everything that made a house a home, was in storage, paid for monthly out of the small remainder of the money from selling my house, the money that hadn't gone into their down payment. I sat on the edge of the bed, a queen-sized bed, but the mattress felt thin. They'd bought it for the room. It wasn't mine. Nothing in the room was truly mine except the clothes in the dresser and the few books on the nightstand. I looked at the books. Titles about gardening, history, novels I'd read years ago. They felt foreign now, like artifacts from a life I no longer lived. The air vent on the ceiling hummed softly, pushing out cool air. It was a constant reminder of the house's systems. Systems I didn't control, systems that belonged to them. I thought about the money, the substantial sum I had given them. It wasn't a loan, not in the traditional sense. There was no contract, no repayment schedule. It was family. It was helping my son. He had said, "It's not your house anymore." Did that mean the money was gone too? Just absorbed into the walls, into the quartz countertop? The thought sent a cold shiver down my spine. It was the deepest betrayal, not just of trust, but of the unspoken contract between parent and child, the one where you sacrifice, you give with the assumption of love, respect, and a place, always, at the table. My place at the table was now contingent on their goodwill, and their goodwill had just run out. The room felt smaller, tighter. The beige walls seemed to press in. I got up and walked to the window. I knelt down, peering out. I could see the bottom of the fence post. A few weeds growing along the foundation. A spider web in the corner of the window pane. It was a narrow, confined view. It felt like a physical representation of my life here. Restricted, limited, dependent. I remembered the view from my old kitchen window. The sprawling oak tree in the backyard. The bird feeder I kept filled. The neighbor's cat stalking through the bushes. Life, vibrant and moving. Here, there was only concrete and a small patch of dirt, and the humming of the vent. I stayed there for a long time, kneeling by the window, watching the light fade. The house above me was quiet. I could hear faint sounds, water running, a door closing, their life continuing. My life, suspended in this basement room, felt stagnant. I pulled out my phone, an old flip phone. I barely used it. I scrolled through the few contacts. My sister, Martha, in Arizona. An old friend, Carol, from my book club, still in town. The number for the storage unit place. I hesitated. Who could I even tell? How could I explain that my own son had told me I was essentially homeless after I had given him everything? Humiliation washed over me, hot and stinging. It wasn't just the practical problem. It was the shame, the failure. As a mother, as a person who thought she had built a secure future not just for hers but by helping her child. I put the phone away. I couldn't talk about it yet. Not to Martha, who would worry incessantly. Not to Carol, who would be shocked and probably pitying. I couldn't bear pity. I stood up. The room felt colder now. The air freshener smell seemed cloying, fake. I needed air, real air. I went upstairs quietly. The back door led to a small patio. It was dark outside. I stepped out, pulling the door shut behind me. The night air was cool and damp. I sat on the edge of a plastic patio chair. The chairs were new, part of the renovation. Not mine. Nothing here was mine, except maybe the air I was breathing. That felt like it was the only thing they hadn't claimed ownership of yet. The stars were out, distant and cold. They felt like the only familiar things in a world that had suddenly become alien. I sat there for a long time, wrapped in the silence and the cool air, trying to comprehend the enormity of what had happened. It wasn't just about a house. It was about erasure, about being told my existence, my contributions, my being had no value within these walls. The silence stretched over the next few days. My son avoided me. Sarah was polite, overly so, her kindness a thin veneer stretched tight over something hard and unyielding underneath. Are you comfortable, mother? She'd ask. Her voice pitched a little too high. Do you need anything? Everything about her performance screamed control. It was the false kindness type of control, the kind that offers a cup of tea while reinforcing invisible boundaries. She'd leave little notes. Please use the coaster for your drink. Dinner at 6:30 sharp. We need quiet downstairs in the mornings for conference calls. Each note was a small, precise jab, a reminder that this was their space, their rules. My life shrank further. I ate meals in silence, listening to them talk about their day, their plans, their friends. I was present, but I was not included. I was a fixture, like a lamp or a chair, meant to occupy a designated space and cause no disruption. I started spending hours in my basement room. It was easier than navigating the minefield upstairs. I read my old books. I looked at the photos on my phone, photos of my old house, my garden, photos of my son when he was a boy, grinning, missing teeth. Those photos felt like proof of a different reality, a different life, a different son. Sometimes I would just sit in the dark, listening to the sounds from upstairs, footsteps, laughter, the television, sounds of a life I was adjacent to, but not part of. The ceramic owl sat on the windowsill upstairs, watching. I imagined it watching me, judging, silently enforcing the rules. One afternoon, I went upstairs to get a glass of water. Sarah was on the phone, talking to someone about paint colors for the hallway. She didn't acknowledge me. I filled my glass from the tap, the water cold against my dry throat. As I turned to go back downstairs, I saw a small framed picture on a side table. It was a wedding photo of my son and Sarah. They looked happy, radiant. My son had his arm around her waist, pulling her close. A wave of something cold washed over me. Not sadness. Exactly. Something harder. A feeling of being utterly disconnected from the person in that photo, the person who was my son, the man who had looked me in the eye and told me I was unwelcome. I went back to my room. The basement air felt heavy. I thought about my money, my house, 30 years of work, saving, building a life, all condensed into this small room, this feeling of dispossession. I remembered a conversation with a neighbor from my old street, just before I moved. Miss Gable? She'd baked me a cake. You're so lucky, she'd said, her voice a little wistful. Moving in with your son, family looking after family. That's how it should be. I had smiled and agreed, even though a small knot of unease had already formed in my stomach. It was the kind of public kindness that masked a private, growing discomfort. Now her words felt like a cruel joke. Family looking after family. It wasn't looking after. It was taking over. It was absorption. I felt like a company that had been acquired, stripped of its assets, and left with nothing but a meaningless nameplate on a door. The beige walls stared back at me. The small window showed the same patch of earth. The humming vent was a constant drone. I felt trapped, not just physically, but emotionally. How could I escape this? How could I possibly reclaim anything when they held all the cards? They had the house, the money, the public face of the loving son and daughter-in-law. I had what? A basement room? A few boxes of belongings, and the chilling certainty that I was entirely at their mercy. Mercy they had shown me they didn't possess. I lay on the thin mattress, staring up at the ceiling. The silence from upstairs felt deliberate now, a silence that amplified my own isolation. I was invisible, unheard, uncared for, a ghost in the machine of their perfect, renovated life. The invisibility was perhaps the worst part. It wasn't just that they ignored me, it was that they acted as if I wasn't there at all. They would plan outings right in front of me, talking about dinner reservations or meeting friends, never once including me or even acknowledging my presence in the room. I remember one Saturday morning, I was sitting at the kitchen table, trying to do a crossword puzzle. Sarah was making coffee. My son came in, pulling on a jacket. Ready? He asked Sarah. Yep, she said, grabbing her keys. See you later, Mom, my son called, not looking at me. Sarah didn't say anything. They left. Just like that. Left me sitting at the table, the crossword half finished, the silence like the house closing in. It wasn't just leaving me out, it was the casualness of it. The assumption that I had no pans, no life, nowhere else to be, which, trapped in their house, was becoming true. My old friends called less often. It was hard to explain where I was, what I was doing. Oh, I'm just staying with my son for a bit, I'd say, trying to sound cheerful, temporary. The permanence of the situation was something I couldn't articulate, couldn't even fully admit to myself. The days blurred into a monotonous routine. I'd wake up in the basement room, go upstairs for a sparse breakfast. I started keeping a box of cereal and some milk in the room because I didn't want to go upstairs when they were there. Spend the day reading or just sitting, waiting for time to pass, eat dinner mostly in silence, and then retreat back downstairs. It was a life reduced to its barest necessities, devoid of joy, of purpose, of connection. My son's earlier words echoed constantly. It's not your house anymore. They were a brand seared onto my mind. Every time I walked through the living room, saw their photos on the wall, used their bathroom, I felt the truth of it. This was their space. I was an intruder. I started taking long walks. I'd leave the house and just walk the quiet, tree-lined streets of Naperville. I'd look at the other houses, imagining the lives inside. Families eating dinner together, children playing, couples sitting on porches, normal lives, lives that felt a million miles away from my own isolated existence. One day, I walked downtown to the Riverwalk. It was a beautiful day, sunny and warm. People were laughing, walking dogs, sitting on benches. I sat on a bench overlooking the water. I felt a pang of intense loneliness, sharper than usual. I watched a family feed the ducks. The mother, the father, the children, together. A unit. I felt like a single, lost satellite spinning adrift in a vast, empty space. I thought about the money again. The down payment. It represented not just my savings, but my security, my planned future. They had taken that, not with a gun, but with quiet words and closed doors. It was a different kind of violence, an emotional one that left no physical bruises but hollowed you out from the inside. The helper character was still missing from this narrative. There was no one, no friend I felt I could burden with this humiliating truth. No lawyer I thought I could afford given my situation. I was utterly alone, and they knew it. My son knew it. That's why he could say what he said with such chilling calm. He knew I had nowhere else to go. He knew he had me, trapped. The sun felt warm on my face, but I felt cold inside. The ducks paddled on the water, oblivious. My mind kept turning over the same phrases, the same images. The kitchen, his words. Sarah's silent back. The beige walls of the basement room. The dwindling balance in my bank account. The locks on the doors of this house that were not mine. The locks that kept me in, but could also keep me out. The thought surfaced slowly, an icy, unwelcome realization. If it wasn't my house, then what rights did I have? What protection? None. I had none. They could ask me to leave any time, and I would have to go, with nothing. The realization that I could be removed at any moment, with no legal standing, was a cold clarity. It cut through the haze of hurt and humiliation. I had signed away my security, my independence, for the promise of a place in their lives. And that promise had been broken, shattered by a few simple words. The fear was paralyzing for a while. I felt a knot of anxiety constantly in my stomach. Every time they looked at me, every time they spoke, I braced myself for the final blow, the request to leave. I started keeping a small bag packed in my closet, just in case. Just a few clothes, toiletries, my phone, my wallet. It felt absurd, preparing for homelessness in my own son's house. But the fear was real. It drove me. It forced me to think beyond the immediate pain. I needed help. I couldn't do this alone. But who? My sister Martha was too far away, and her health wasn't good. I didn't want to worry her. Carol, my friend from the book club, she was kind, but not really equipped for this kind of crisis. I needed someone with knowledge, with experience, legal experience. I didn't have money for a lawyer, not a fancy one anyway. But maybe there were options. Legal aid? A pro bono service? I didn't even know where to start. I spent hours online in the basement room, on my phone, searching. My old flip phone wasn't good for browsing. I had to use the old desktop computer in the corner of the basement. the one they rarely used. It was slow and clunky. I typed in search terms like elder abuse financial, family property disputes, what happens when you give child money for house. The results were overwhelming, confusing. Most seemed to apply to situations with contracts or formal agreements. I had none, just a verbal agreement. A mother's trust in her son, worthless, it seemed, in the face of ambition and indifference. One day, while searching, I stumbled across a website for a local senior services center in Naperville. It mentioned legal assistance as one of their services, low cost or free consultations. A tiny spark of hope flickered. It was something, a concrete step I could take. I wrote down the number. I stared at it for a long time. My hand shook slightly. Making that call felt like admitting defeat, admitting how bad things really were, admitting that my own son had put me in a position where I needed outside help. It felt like airing dirty laundry, the most shameful kind. But the alternative was doing nothing. And doing nothing meant staying trapped, waiting for the inevitable. It meant accepting the erasure. I couldn't do that. Not anymore. The fear was still there, but beneath it, something else was starting to surface. A hardening, a quiet anger. The anger wasn't loud or explosive. It was cold, deep, and steady, like a stone being smoothed by a relentless current. They had taken so much, but they couldn't take my dignity. Not if I fought back. The decision solidified. I would call the center. I would find out what my options were. Even if there were none, I needed to know. I needed to stop just enduring and start acting. The air in the basement room felt a little less heavy. The beige walls seemed less oppressive. The small patch of earth outside the window didn't look quite so desolate. I wasn't alone in this. There were resources, people who helped. I held on to that thought like a lifeline. It was the first positive feeling I had experienced in weeks. The first sense of possibility. It was a small shift, almost imperceptible, but it was there. The fear hadn't gone away, but it was no longer paralyzing. It was becoming fuel. Fuel for action. The decision to seek help felt like the first step out of the emotional cage they had built around me. The phone call to the Senior Services Center in Naperville was brief and formal. I spoke to a woman named Brenda. Her voice was calm, professional. I explained, hesitantly, the basic situation. I had contributed significantly to my son's home purchase with the understanding I would live there. And now I was being made to feel unwelcome. Told it wasn't my home. I didn't mention the exact amount, just that it was a large sum, representing the bulk of my assets. I didn't mention his exact words. The humiliation was still too raw. Brenda listened patiently. She didn't express shock or pity, just asked clarifying questions. Was there a written agreement? No. Any documentation of the transfer of funds? Yes. Bank records. Did you have a separate lease agreement? No. It all sounded so flimsy when laid out plainly. A verbal agreement between family. Brenda explained that without a written contract or lease, establishing a legal claim to residency or repayment could be challenging. It wasn't impossible, she said, but it would be difficult. It might be considered a gift. A gift. The word felt like a punch to the gut. All my sacrifice, my security, dismissed as a mere gift. But she didn't dismiss me. She suggested a consultation with one of their volunteer legal advisors, an attorney who specialized in elder law or property disputes. It would be free. I agreed immediately. The appointment was set for the following week. Hanging up the phone, I felt a mix of trepidation and relief. At least I was doing something. Taking control of this part, the part where I sought information and assistance. I didn't tell my son or Sarah about the call. This was my business, my secret plan forming in the quiet of the basement. The tone in the house hadn't changed. The polite distance remained. They went about their lives, and I stayed in my room. But now, when I heard them talking, their laughter, their plans, it didn't just feel like exclusion. It felt like confirmation. Confirmation that I needed to find my own way out. I started noticing details about the house that might be useful. Little things. The lock on the back door, a standard deadbolt. The one on the front door, also standard. How they came and went, their schedules. I wasn't planning anything nefarious, just gathering information. Information felt like power, a small measure of it. The anticipation of the legal consultation was a new kind of anxiety, but also a focus. It gave my days structure. I pulled out my old bank statements, finding the record of the large transfer. It was a stark reminder of what I had given up: the date, the amount, black and white proof of my financial contribution. It wasn't a gift. It was an investment in a future that was being denied to me. I put the statement in a safe place, in the small bag I kept packed. The packed bag was no longer just about fearing sudden eviction. It was also about preparing for a possible departure on my own terms. Slowly, painstakingly, the shift was occurring, from passive victim to active participant in my own fate. The quiet rage was simmering, fueling a cold, calculated determination. They wanted me gone, perhaps, but they wouldn't get away with taking everything and leaving me with nothing. Not without a fight. A quiet fight, perhaps, fought with documents and laws, not shouting or drama. The idea of changing the locks hadn't fully formed yet, not as a concrete action, but the concept of physical control, of determining who had access to a space, was starting to take root. The locks on their doors kept me in a subordinate position. What if I controlled the lock? The consultation was with a lawyer named Mr. Evans. He was older, with kind eyes and a quiet demeanor. His office was small, neat, lined with bookshelves. He listened patiently, without interruption, as I recounted the events. The sale of my house, the contribution to their purchase, the move-in, the gradual exclusion, the words my son had spoken. I handed him the bank statement. He examined it, nodding. "This is clear evidence of a significant financial contribution," he said. His words were precise, measured. He didn't offer false hope. He explained the complexities, the difficulty of proving intent without a written agreement. He explained the legal concept of a gift versus a loan or investment. It often came down to the documented intent at the time of the transfer. He noted that while I might not have a clear path to forcing them to repay the full amount immediately, I might have grounds to claim a right to continued residency, or at least a more formal eviction process that would give me time and potentially leverage. He talked about unjust enrichment, a legal principle where someone shouldn't benefit unfairly at another's expense. It was complicated, he stressed. Family matters often were: emotions, lack of documentation. But he didn't dismiss my situation. He validated it. "What they are doing," he said, looking directly at me, "is not right. Regardless of the legal technicalities, it is morally wrong." His words were a balm. Someone finally saw it for what it was. Not just a family squabble, but an injustice. He outlined potential steps: a formal letter from his office, stating my residency and contribution, requesting a meeting to discuss a fair resolution, mediation, if necessary, exploring legal action, though he cautioned that lawsuits were costly, time-consuming, and emotionally draining, especially against family. He didn't push me towards immediate legal action. His advice was practical. Start with the letter, he suggested. Sometimes, formal communication from an attorney is enough to make Keith understand the seriousness of the situation. It was a small step, but it felt monumental. It was the first time someone outside the situation had acknowledged my plight and offered a path forward. Leaving his office, I felt lighter yet also heavier with the weight of the potential conflict. But the paralyzing fear was gone, replaced by a quiet resolve. I authorized Mr. Evans to send the letter. Giving him permission felt like handing over a burden, but also like empowering myself. I was no longer just enduring. I was asserting. The letter wouldn't demand anything specific yet, just open the door for negotiation, acknowledge my residency and contribution, and signal that I wasn't going to disappear quietly. It was a formal marker, a line drawn in the sand. It shifted the dynamic. I wasn't just mom in the basement anymore. I was also, potentially, an adversary with legal counsel. I didn't know how they would react. Anger, denial, cooperation. The uncertainty was unsettling, but doing nothing was no longer an option. Mr. Evans had given me tools, options, and crucially, validation. The beige basement room no longer felt solely like a prison. It felt like a temporary base of operations. I was still here, in their house, on their terms, in many ways. But I was also preparing to leave, on my terms. The letter from Mr. Evans arrived at the house a few days later. It was a Thursday. I was upstairs, getting a glass of water, when I heard the mail slot open. Sarah was working in her office, the door closed. My son was at work. I walked into the front hallway and saw the envelope on the floor. It had Mr. Evans's firm's letterhead, addressed to both my son and Sarah. I picked it up. My heart pounded. This was it. the formal opening of the conflict. I took it downstairs to my room. I didn't open it, of course. It wasn't addressed to me. I just held it, feeling the weight of it. It wasn't just paper. It was a declaration. I waited. I heard my son come home, heard them talking, heard the moment they found the letter. There was silence first, a long, heavy silence. Then raised voices, not shouting, but sharp, angry tones. I couldn't make out the words, but the emotion was clear. Anger. Directed, I knew, at me. For daring to seek help, for daring to challenge their narrative. The silence that followed the argument was perhaps worse than the anger. A cold, deliberate silence that extended into the evening. Dinner was a tense affair. They barely spoke to each other, and not at all to me. My son's face was grim, set in a hard line. Sarah avoided my eyes. The air crackled with unspoken accusation. After dinner, as I was clearing my plate, my son finally spoke. His voice was low, controlled, but laced with fury. "We got a letter, Mom?" He didn't need to say from whom. "What do you think you're doing?" His tone was not a question seeking information, but an accusation demanding into justification. I met his gaze, surprised by my own calmness. The fear was still there, a tremor beneath the surface, but the quiet anger was stronger. "Try and understand my options," I said simply. "Options?" He scoffed. "What options? We gave you a place to live, out of the goodness of our hearts." Sarah stood beside him, arms crossed, a mirror of his posture in the kitchen weeks ago. "Goodness of your hearts?" I repeated, the words tasting like ash. "I sold my house. I gave you all my money for this down payment. It wasn't charity. It was a gift, Mom," he insisted, his voice rising slightly. "That's what you said. You wanted to help us. I wanted to help you build a future where I also had a place," I countered, my voice steady despite the trembling inside. Not to be told it's not my house anymore, and treated like an inconvenience. The ceramic owl on the kitchen windowsill seemed to watch, its eyes dark and impassive. This wasn't the quiet conversation in Mr. Evans's office. This was the messy, emotional confrontation I had dreaded. But facing it, speaking the truth aloud, felt like breaking through a barrier. Sarah spoke then, her voice tight. "We never said you had no place. We just met. It's our house. We make the decisions. And your decision was to make me feel unwelcome," I said, "to ignore me, to treat me like a burden." My son stepped closer, his face flushed. "We don't need this, Mom. This is ridiculous, getting lawyers involved." "You left me no choice," I said, my voice barely a whisper but firm. "You took everything. My home. My security. You told me I had nothing. What did you expect me to do?" He didn't answer. He just stared at me, his expression a mixture of anger and something else, something I couldn't quite read. Perhaps surprise that I had pushed back. Perhaps a flicker of guilt, quickly suppressed. The air in the kitchen was thick with tension. The argument hung in the air, unresolved. The letter had done its job. It had broken the silence, forced the confrontation. It hadn't brought resolution, not yet, but it had changed everything. The quiet Cold War was over. The battle lines had been drawn, and I was no longer fighting from the shadows of the basement. The tension in the house became a physical presence. It hummed in the air, heavy and suffocating. My son and Sarah spoke to me only when necessary. Their words clipped, their tones cold. The forced politeness was gone, replaced by thinly veiled hostility. They made their displeasure clear through small, pointed actions, leaving passive-aggressive notes. "A lawyer's letter was a bit extreme, don't you think?" Making sure I overheard them discussing potential options for my living situation. Maybe a nice senior apartment complex? The subtle acts of invisibility escalated. One evening, they had friends over for dinner. I stayed in my basement room. I could hear the laughter, the music, the clinking of glasses from upstairs. Later, as their friends were leaving, I heard one of the friends ask, "Is your mother visiting?" My son's response was curt. "Just for a while." He made it sound temporary, inconvenient, as if I was a distant relative here for a short, awkward stay, not the woman who had helped them buy the house. I felt a fresh wave of humiliation. They were presenting a false reality to their friends, minimizing my presence, framing the situation in a way that protected their image. It was a public performance masking the private cruelty. Miss Evans called a few days later. He had received a response from an attorney representing my son and Sarah. The letter was brief, denying any agreement for me to live there permanently or indefinitely, stating my financial contribution was understood as a gift and requesting that I make arrangements to find alternative housing. They offered me a small lump sum, far less than what I had contributed, as a gesture of goodwill to help with moving expenses. It was insulting, a pittance compared to everything I had given. It confirmed their position. I was unwanted, my contribution dismissed, and they were now actively trying to push me out. Mr. Evans was not surprised. This is a common tactic, he said. Minimize your claim, offer a small amount to make it go away. It doesn't mean their legal position is strong, but it shows their intent. He outlined the next step: formal mediation, a neutral third party to help us negotiate. If mediation failed, the only option left would be litigation. Lawsuits terrified me. The thought of facing my son across a courtroom, airing all this painful, humiliating history in public. But the alternative was accepting their offer, walking away with almost nothing, and being left vulnerable and without resources. I couldn't do that. I wouldn't. The quiet anger solidified into a hard resolve. They had taken my home, tried to take my dignity, and now they were trying to buy me off for pennies. No, this wasn't just about money or property anymore. It was about principle, about standing up for myself. I instructed Mr. Evans to accept the offer of mediation. It felt like stepping onto a battlefield, albeit a quiet conference room kind of battlefield. But the stakes were high: my future, my financial security, my sense of self-worth. The date for mediation was set for a few weeks away. The waiting period was agonizing. Living in the house felt increasingly unbearable. Every look, every silence was a reminder of the conflict. I started spending more time outside the house: libraries, parks, coffee shops, anywhere but there. The basement room became just a place to sleep. I was already mentally moving out. The physical act was the only thing left. The day of the mediation arrived. It was held in a neutral office building downtown. Mr. Evans was with me. My son and Sarah were in a separate room with their lawyer. The mediator, a calm older woman, moved between the rooms, carrying offers and counter-offers, facilitating discussion without direct confrontation. It was a sterile environment for such raw, emotional conflict. The numbers were presented, what I had given, what they were offering. The gap was enormous. Their lawyer reiterated that their position was that the money was a gift. My lawyer presented evidence of my reliance on living there, the context of selling my own home, arguing unjust enrichment. The mediator explored possibilities: a larger settlement, a timeline for me to find new housing, maybe even them contributing to my rent for a period. Every offer from their side felt like a slap in the face. The goodwill gesture was increased slightly, but still woefully inadequate. It was clear they wanted me out, quickly and cheaply. I sat there, listening to the numbers, the legal arguments, feeling strangely detached. It wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about being seen, about having my contributions acknowledged. They refused to see it as anything but a transaction they regretted, a burden they wanted to shed. At one point, the mediator relayed a message from my son. He wasn't apologetic, he wasn't even trying to find common ground. He simply stated that this was causing stress, impacting their lives, and he just wanted it resolved so they could move on. Move on. As if I was just an obstacle to their happiness, easily cleared away. The coldness of his message was devastating. It confirmed that the son I had raised, the boy who had needed me, relied on me, was gone, replaced by this man who saw me only as a problem. We reached an impasse. They wouldn't budge significantly on the money. I wouldn't accept their insulting offer. Mr. Evans advised me that my legal options were limited without a written agreement. A lawsuit would be a gamble, expensive and emotionally draining, with no guarantee of winning back anything close to what I had given. He laid out the reality plainly. My options were to accept their final offer, meager as it was, or pursue litigation with uncertain outcomes. It was a painful moment. The hope I had carried into the mediation room began to drain away. Had I come all this way, gone through all this emotional turmoil, just to be told there was no real justice to be had, no legal recourse for a mother's broken heart and empty bank account? We didn't reach an agreement. The mediation ended. Mr. Evans said he would send a letter formally rejecting their offer and stating that I was exploring my next steps. Leaving the building, The air outside felt cold and harsh. I had faced them indirectly. I had stated my case, but it hadn't been enough. They held the power, they had the house, the money, the lack of conscience that allowed them to dismiss my sacrifice so easily. I felt a profound weariness settle over me. What was left? Returning to the house after mediation was like stepping back into the cage, except now the bars felt tighter, the air thinner. The failure of the mediation hung heavy. It felt like the last formal avenue for resolution had closed. My son and Sarah were polite, but the distance was greater than ever. They knew I had rejected their offer, knew I was contemplating further action, and they were wary. And I knew, with chilling certainty, that they were prepared to wait me out, to make my life there so uncomfortable that I would eventually give up and leave with nothing. The thought of continued litigation, the cost, the emotional toll, seemed insurmountable. Mr. Evans had been honest about the challenges. The legal system wasn't designed to mend broken family bonds or punish ingratitude. It dealt with contracts, with document agreements. I had neither. I spent days in the basement room, rereading my old books, staring out the window at the patch of dirt. The packed bag in the closet felt less like preparation and more like a symbol of my readiness to flee. Despair started to creep in, cold and insidious. Had I made a mistake? Should I have just taken their offer, however insulting, and tried to start over somewhere else? But the thought of letting them get away with it, of them profiting from my sacrifice while casting me aside, was unbearable. It felt like a violation on a fundamental level, a violation of trust, of family, of basic human decency. I thought about the house itself, the walls that held their life, built partly with my money, the locks that secured their safety, their property, the locks that kept me in a state of dependence, a state they controlled. The idea, faint at first, began to form. Not a legal strategy, something else, something more direct, more personal. It was a dangerous thought, born of desperation and the quiet, cold anger that had been simmering for months. If it wasn't my house anymore, if they had removed all traces of my ownership, my contribution, then what right did they have to keep me there under duress? To treat me as if I had no agency, no power? The house was their symbol of control. What if I disrupted that symbol? Not with lawyers or courtrooms, but with a simple, physical act that declared my independence, my reclaiming of power. The thought of changing the locks began to take shape, not as a vengeful act, but as a necessary one. A way to sever the connection, to take back control of my exit, my departure on my terms. It wouldn't give me my money back. It wouldn't magically mend the broken relationship with my son, but it would be an undeniable statement, a final boundary. It would force the issue, yes, but it would also allow me to leave with a shred of dignity, having refused to be simply discarded. The risks were obvious. Their anger, the potential for further conflict. But the alternative, staying there, eroding bit by bit, felt like a slower, more agonizing end. The quiet despair began to recede, replaced by a different kind of resolve, a grim, determined certainty. The house was theirs, fine, but I would not be held captive by it. I would leave when I was ready, in a way that asserted my refusal to be invisible, my refusal to be powerless. The locks, they were the key. The physical manifestation of who belonged, who was in control. I would change the locks, and then I would walk away. The plan formed quietly in my mind over the next few days. It wasn't complicated. It relied on timing and the element of surprise. I would need a locksmith. I would need to pack my things, the few I had here, and be ready to leave immediately after the locks were changed. I needed to coordinate with Mr. Evans, not necessarily for legal cover, but to inform him and perhaps have him communicate with my son and Sarah's lawyer immediately afterwards to manage the fallout. The emotional part was harder than the logistical. The finality of it, the burning of the last bridge, perhaps with my son. But the bridge felt long gone anyway, reduced dirt, ashes by his own words and actions. I chose a weekday morning. My son and Sarah both left for work around the same time, usually between 7:30 and 8 a.m. That would give me a window. I found a local locksmith online, one with good reviews. I called them from a park bench, speaking softly, arranging for them to come to the house on a specific morning. I explained, vaguely, that it was my residence and I needed the locks changed. I didn't go into detail. They didn't ask many questions. It was a service they provided. I packed my small bag more fully. The bank statement, my identification, a few changes of clothes. I withdrew the small amount of money I had left in my checking account. It wouldn't last long, but it was enough for a few weeks in a motel. Time to figure out the very next step. I also contacted Carol, my friend from the book club. Not to confide the whole story, not yet. Just to ask if I could potentially stay with her for a night or two on short notice, explaining only that I was having some difficult family issues and needed a temporary place to land. Carol, bless her, didn't hesitate. Of course, she said immediately. Anytime you need, just call. Her simple kindness was a lifeline, a reminder that not everyone was like my son and Sarah. There were people who still offered help without strings, without a price. The day before I planned to do it, I wrote a letter, not a formal one like Mr. Evans would write, a personal one. To my son, I wrote it out longhand on a notepad in the basement room. I wrote about my love for him, about the life I had built before, about the sacrifice I had made, and about the pain his words had caused. I didn't accuse or demand. I simply stated the truth of my experience, my feelings. I explained that I was leaving, that I couldn't stay where I was unwanted. I didn't mention the lock. That felt like a detail that would speak for itself. I sealed the letter and addressed it to him. I placed it on the kitchen counter that evening, when they were both out, a final message, left in the heart of the space that was no longer mine. That night, I barely slept. My stomach was a knot of nerves. But beneath the anxiety, there was a hard kernel of resolve. I was doing this. I was taking back control. The house was silent. I listened to their footsteps above, the mundane sounds of their evening routine. Soon, those sounds would be just memories. The morning of the lock change. I woke before dawn. The basement room was cold. I dressed quietly, put my small bag by the door. I waited, listened for the sounds upstairs. The coffee maker, footsteps, doors opening and closing, their cars starting in the driveway, the sounds receding. Silent. I checked the time. 7:52 a.m. The house was empty. It was time. I went upstairs. The kitchen was quiet. The ceramic owl sat on the windowsill, its dark eyes seeming to follow me. I ignored it. I went to the front door. I had the locksmith's number in my hand. I stepped outside, closing the door softly behind me. I stood on the porch for a moment, breathing the cool morning air. The neighborhood was quiet, peaceful, normal, a stark contrast to the turmoil inside the house. Inside me. I walked down the driveway, just far enough so I could see the front of the house clearly. I dialed the locksmith's number. "I'm ready," I said. "You can come now." They said they would be there in about 15 minutes. I waited on the sidewalk, trying to look casual, like I was just out for a walk. My heart hammered in my chest. This was it. The point of no return. A van with the locksmith's logo arrived. A young man got out, carrying a toolbox. I met him at the front door. "Just this one?" he asked, indicating the front door. "And the back door," I said. He nodded. He worked efficiently, professionally. The old locks were removed, new ones installed. It took less than 30 minutes. He handed me 2 sets of new keys. They were cool and heavy in my hand. I paid him, signed the receipt. He left. I stood there for a moment, looking at the new lock on the front door. It looked the same, but it represented something entirely different. Access granted, and access denied. I was granting access to myself for this final act, denying it to the people who owned the house, but no longer controlled my entry or exit. I let myself in. The house was silent. It felt different now. Not hostile, exactly, but neutral, empty of the emotional weight it had carried. I walked through the rooms one last time. The living room, the dining room, the kitchen with the quartz countertop and the ceramic owl. They looked like rooms in a magazine, impersonal and clean. Not a home. Not my home. Certainly. I went downstairs to the basement room. I grabbed my bag. It felt light. I did a final sweep of the room, making sure I hadn't left anything important. My old books. They could keep the books. They didn't matter anymore. I had the essential things. My identification, the money, the bank statement, the keys to the storage unit where my furniture waited, proof of a life that existed independently of this house. I walked back upstairs. I went to the kitchen counter where I had left the letter to my son. It was still there, unread. I picked it up. No, he needed to read it. He needed to understand. I left it. I walked to the front door. I took a deep breath and I walked out, pulling the door shut firmly behind me. The click of the new lock was loud in the quiet morning. I stood on the porch for a moment, the new keys in my hand. I wasn't just leaving the house. I was leaving a life I had tried to force myself into, a life that had rejected me. I walked down the driveway for the last time. I didn't look back. I walked to where my car was parked, down the street. I got in, started the engine. I drove away from the house, away from Naperville, away from the silence and the control. I was heading for Carol's. I didn't know what came next. Legal battles, financial uncertainty, the gaping wound of a broken family. But as I drove, clutching the new keys, a sense of quiet, profound relief washed over me. I was free. I had changed the locks, yes. But more importantly, I had changed my own lock, the one that kept me trapped in fear and powerlessness. Finding a new place to live was difficult, but with the small amount of money I had and the temporary stability Carol provided, I managed. I found a small, one-bedroom apartment in a modest building a few towns over, in Aurora. It wasn't much, but it was clean and quiet. And it was mine, just mine. No one else's rules, no silent judgments, no feeling of being an intruder. Moving my few boxes from storage into the apartment felt like reclaiming pieces of myself. Familiar objects, a lamp, a chair, a set of dishes that hadn't seen the light of day in months. Arranging them in the small space felt like building a new foundation. The furniture from storage arrived a week later. My favorite armchair, the small table I used for writing. They weren't new or fancy, but they were mine. Placing them in the living room made the apartment finally feel like a home. My home. The silence in the apartment was different from the silence in the basement room. That silence had been oppressive, filled with unspoken tension and my own anxiety. This silence was peaceful. It was quiet, not empty. I could hear the refrigerator hum, the distant sound of traffic, the rain against the window pane, sounds of a normal, independent life. Mr. Evans continued to communicate with my son and Sarah's lawyer. Changing the locks had, predictably, caused a strong reaction, anger, demands for keys, for access. Their lawyer accused me of illegal eviction, of trespass. Mr. Evans calmly stated that I had established residency, that the situation was complex, and that my action was a response to their attempts to remove me and dismiss my significant financial contribution. The negotiation continued, slowly, formally. It wasn't about forcing me back into the house. That was never my goal after he spoke those words. It was about reaching a financial settlement, some acknowledgement of what I had lost. It was a long, drawn-out process, conducted at a distance through lawyers. It was painful, knowing the conflict continued, but also necessary. I focused on building my new life in the apartment. I joined the local library. I found a nearby park for walks. I started cooking meals for myself again, some things, but in my own kitchen, using my own pots and pans. These small acts were rituals of reclaiming, each one a quiet victory. The emotional wounds were deep. The relationship with my son was fractured, perhaps irreparably. He hadn't called me directly, not once since I left. Everything was through the lawyers. It hurt, a constant, dull ache, but it was also confirmation. Confirmation that staying there, clinging to the hope of a relationship that no longer existed, would have been a form of slow suicide. One evening, sitting in my own armchair, in my own quiet living room, I received an email. It was from Miss Evans, a final offer from my son and Sarah. It was significantly higher than their previous offers. Still not the full amount, not even close. But it was something, an acknowledgement, perhaps, forced by the situation, that I wouldn't just disappear. It was enough to provide a cushion, some security, enough to supplement my small savings and live modestly without the constant fear of running out of money. I read the email several times. It wasn't a victory in the way I might have once imagined. There was no grand gesture of reconciliation, no apology, just a number on a screen. But it was a form of resolution, a closing of the financial chapter, however unsatisfactory. I replied to Mr. Evans, instructing him to accept the offer. It was time to end the formal conflict. Time to stop fighting and start living. The next day, I went for a walk in the park near my apartment. The sun was shining. Children were playing on a playground. Dogs barked. Life was happening, vibrant and moving. I sat on a bench feeling the warmth of the sun on my face. The house in Naperville, the basement room, the quartz countertop, the ceramic owl, they felt distant, like a bad dream that was finally fading. The keys to my apartment were in my pocket, solid and real. I had lost a house, lost a son in many ways, but I had found something too. My own footing, my own space, my own peace. The peace wasn't loud or triumphant. It was quiet, deep, earned. The locks I changed were on their doors, but the door that mattered most was the one I had opened for myself, walking out into my own uncertain, independent future. A future I would build quietly, deliberately, on my own terms.